The tragedy of Fidenae reveals how profit-driven construction, a freedman's ambition, and a crowd's thirst for spectacle converge to create one of antiquity's deadliest collapses. On the darkest days in history, we dig into the worst structural disaster of ancient Rome. If you find these excavations into antiquity's darkest moments compelling, subscribe to the darkest days in history. In 27 CE, a hastily erected wooden amphitheatre in the modest town of Fidenae buckled during a packed gladiatorial spectacle, burying tens of thousands beneath timber and debris. The Roman historian Tacitus recorded an estimated 50,000 dead, making the Fidenae amphitheatre collapse one of Rome's worst structural failures. How did a structure meant for entertainment become a mass tomb for Roman citizens? Why did the Senate respond with wealth restrictions instead of engineering standards? The answers expose a society where ambition outpaced safety and where the cost of spectacle was measured in lives. Before the catastrophe, Fidenae was a small town near Rome that rarely hosted gladiatorial games. Most Romans experienced such spectacles in permanent stone amphitheaters, the kind we associate with the Colosseum. But popular imagination often assumes all major Roman arenas were permanent stone structures. The reality at Fidenae was strikingly different. A freedman named Atilius saw an opportunity. Freedmen occupied a unique social position in Roman society. Former slaves who had been granted their liberty, now eager to prove their worth through public works and entertainment. Atilius decided to build an amphitheatre entirely of wood, without stone foundations, driven by profit and the desire to establish his reputation. The decision to forgo stone foundations was not merely a corner cut. It was a fundamental engineering compromise that would prove fatal. Wooden construction was not unprecedented in Rome's early history. Before permanent stone arenas became common, temporary wooden structures had hosted games for centuries. But by 27 CE, the expectations of Roman crowds had grown enormous. Atilius built quickly and cheaply, likely sourcing timber without regard for load, bearing calculations, or structural redundancy. There were no formal engineering standards for wooden amphitheaters, no inspections, no oversight. The profit motive drove every decision. Fidenae's location made it especially attractive for a spectacle. Situated just a few miles from Rome, the town was close enough to draw massive crowds from the capital, far enough that games were a rare novelty. Thousands of Romans flooded in, families, merchants, soldiers, and slaves, all eager for entertainment that rarely reached their corner of the world. The crowd's enthusiasm was extraordinary, and the wooden structure was forced to support far more spectators than its fragile frame could bear. A profit-driven builder without engineering expertise, a structure built without foundations, a town desperate for spectacle, and a crowd that overwhelmed every beam and joint. Stay with the darkest days in history as we examine how Rome's Senate responded to catastrophe. The stage was set for one of the ancient world's worst disasters, and no one inside. The arena that day understood how close the timber above them was to giving way. Gladiators clashed in the arena below, while thousands of Romans packed the wooden tiers above, cheering, betting, immersed in the spectacle. The atmosphere would have been electric, the roar of the crowd echoing off timber walls, the dust and heat of combat rising from the sand below. For the spectators, this was a rare gift, entertainment brought to their doorstep. They had no reason to question the structure beneath their feet. Tacitus attributes the catastrophe to the wooden amphitheatre, buckling under the weight of an enormous crowd. The timber groaned, joints separated, and load, bearing beams that had never been properly calculated, began to splinter. The collapse was not gradual. The structure folded inward, the upper tiers crashing down upon those below in a cascade of wood, rope, and human bodies. Spectators who had been cheering moments earlier were buried in timber and debris, trapped in a wreckage of broken beams and shattered seating. The scale of the disaster was almost incomprehensible. Tacitus records an estimated death toll of 50,000 spectators. Tell us in the comments which clue about the arena feels most convincing so far. 50,000 Romans, gathered for a day of entertainment, killed by the very structure built to host them. To put this in perspective, the Fidenae amphitheatre collapse killed more people than some of Rome's most notorious military defeats. Entire communities lost fathers, mothers, children, and neighbors in a single afternoon. The grief that swept through Fidenae and the surrounding towns would have been overwhelming. The economic stakes were equally devastating. The loss of 50,000 lives meant the loss of workers, merchants, soldiers, and tradespeople. The local economy around Fidenae would have been gutted, and the ripple effects would have reached Rome itself. The social fabric of the community was torn apart, trust in public infrastructure shattered. The emotional toll, grief and loss of community members, during what should have been a celebration, would linger for generations. Tacitus's figure of 50,000 dead has shaped our perception of the disaster's magnitude ever since. Whether the number is precise or slightly inflated, the Fidenae amphitheatre collapse stands as one of ancient Rome's worst structural failures, a catastrophe born not from war or natural disaster but from human ambition and negligence. The Roman Senate moved swiftly. In the aftermath of the Fidenae amphitheatre collapse, senators faced a crisis not just of public safety, but of public confidence. 50,000 Roman citizens dead, buried in a wooden tomb built by a freedman with no engineering expertise. The political pressure was immense, and the Senate needed to act decisively. Their response was a law that banned anyone with less than 400,000 sesterces from building amphitheaters. This seemed like a reasonable safeguard. A builder with substantial wealth would presumably have more to lose and more resources to invest in quality construction. But the Senate's choice reveals something deeper about Roman priorities. They did not institute engineering inspections. They did not require structural certifications, or mandate stone foundations, or establish a regulatory body to oversee construction. They chose financial qualification as the primary safeguard against future disasters. This decision exposes several hidden pressures that shaped Roman governance. First, the profit motive of builders like Atilius was understood, but not directly regulated. The Senate recognized that cheap, hastily built structures were dangerous, but rather than addressing construction quality, they addressed the builder's bank account. Second, there were no formal engineering standards for wooden structures in Rome. The knowledge to build safe, large-scale wooden arenas may not have existed in codified form, making financial qualification the easiest control mechanism available. Third, the political desire for games persisted. Roman society thrived on spectacle, and senators themselves often sponsored gladiatorial games to win public favor. Banning wooden amphitheaters entirely would have restricted access to entertainment in smaller towns and angered the public. A wealth threshold allowed games to continue, while theoretically preventing the poorest builders from cutting corners. The result was a system that regulated safety through wealth, rather than engineering standards. A freedman like Atilius, driven by profit and ambition, would be excluded. But a wealthy builder with equally poor engineering practices would face no technical scrutiny. The law addressed the social dimension of the problem, the audacity of a low status. Freedmen undertaking a massive public works project without fully addressing the structural dimension. The Fidenae amphitheatre collapse exposed a society that understood the cost of failure, but chose to guard against it through class and capital rather than competence. The Fidenae amphitheatre collapse remains one of history's deadliest structural failures, a catastrophe where 50,000 Romans perished, not in battle or plague, beneath the timber of a profit-driven builder's ambition. The ruins of that wooden arena are long gone, consumed by time and decay. The memory of what happened at Fidenae endures in the pages of Tacitus and in the lessons it left behind. The Roman Senate's response, a wealth threshold of 400,000 sesterces, was a revealing choice. It tells us that Rome regulated safety through capital rather than engineering, through class rather than competence. The parallels to modern structural failures are unmistakable. We still see echoes of Fidenae today, in stadium collapses, in crowd crushes at entertainment venues, in the tension between public demand for spectacle. The infrastructure meant to contain it. For more investigations into the catastrophes that shape civilization, follow the darkest days in history. The story of Fidenae is not just about ancient timber and a freedman's ambition. It is about the human cost of unchecked ambition and inadequate regulation. A lesson written in 50,000 lives that still echoes whenever we fail to learn from the past. Subscribe to keep exploring the arena, and stay curious about what the evidence is still hiding.